Welcome to the world of bomb ping pong, where a few days ago it was the United States' turn, and just about an hour ago it became Iran's turn. We live in high-stakes times, and unsurprisingly, you had a bunch of questions about what exactly is going on and what will be going on in the near future. Well, early this morning, at approximately 1 a.m. Eastern, I started recording my answers to your questions. I am just now getting around to editing everything together, and lo and behold, the world has changed once again, with Iran now apparently attacking US bases in Qatar and in Iraq. Fortunately for me, what is going on right now does not really affect what I had to say earlier, but at various points during today's video, you will hear present me interrupting past me to provide you with some key updates every now and then. Hope you enjoy it, and let's get to the first question. How come the oil prices aren't through the roof at the moment? Well, this is a tricky thing the first time you're trying to understand how futures markets work. But markets do not react to the news as it is happening. And instead, what they're really reacting to are changes in expectations based on what is happening in the news. Let me give you an example of this going back to the presidential election in November and Trump's inauguration in January. When Trump gets inaugurated in January, there is now a change to who is president of the United States. However, there is not much of a change in expectations about who is going to be president of the United States from the beginning of January to the end of January. Everyone going into January is under the belief that Donald Trump will become president of the United States, and when he does become president of the United States later in the month, the expectation has barely changed there. In contrast, going back to November of 2024, there was uncertainty, genuine uncertainty at the beginning of the month, whether Harris or Trump was going to win the election. And so any changes to what futures markets are thinking are going to bake into that process what happens at the end of the election in November 2024 into those future prices, because that is when there is something that is learned. It's unclear before November who's going to be president. It becomes much clearer after the election who is going to become president. So that is where we observe the changes in what was going on with the futures markets based on who was going to be president in January of 2025. Well, moving on to what we're talking about now, any changes that are going to happen in the futures market based on what occurred with the US strikes on Iran are going to be as a result in changes to expectations about what the United States was going to do, and perhaps how Iran might react after the fact. If we look at what futures prices are right now, it is about 2% as I'm recording this. The futures prices have gone up 2% as a consequence of the attack, which isn't very much at all. So what that tells us is that the futures markets were expecting Trump to do something, and now that Trump has done something, and it's consistent with those expectations, by and large, the futures markets are not actually going to react to that all that much. Now, thinking about what might happen next, the real concern for the futures market perhaps is something along the lines of Iran shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. And it is possible that what the futures markets thought, and now still think, is that conditional on there being an attack by the United States on Iran on just a few facilities like this, that the risk of Iran trying to shut down the Strait of Hormuz is relatively low, and then as a consequence of that, the futures markets do not react to the attack happening. But that does mean that if Iran takes some actions that are moving toward the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, that is when we would start to see oil prices spiking, because the markets would be reacting to new expectations that are different than the current expectations. Oh, hello there. Greetings from the future. It's me. And Iran has indeed retaliated, but again, as I alluded to at the beginning of the video, it's relatively minimal. It seems to be just a handful of missile strikes on bases in Iraq and in Qatar. And to throw you for a bit of a further loop here, oil futures prices are actually down, which would indicate that the market had previously been betting that the average Iranian retaliation was going to be more substantial than what we have seen so far. And, in turn, because Iran appears to be going for a performative counterstrike, the United States might just look at this and say, okay, we're done. And that actually ties into the next question, so if I may, I now turn it over to past me. Past me? Go ahead. Today, I listened to some political experts who argued that despite all of the threats, Iran will do nothing to further upset Trump. In fact, their retaliation will be mostly symbolic, since the Ayatollahs don't want to invite another raid of American bombers. Do you agree with this prognosis? Yeah, I do think that's a reasonable expectation about what might happen next. If you think about all of the US bases in the region, there are a ton, and very little would stop Iran from deciding that instead of firing a whole bunch of missiles at Israel, which has been going on for many days now, Iran just takes a handful of those and decides to fire them at some of those bases instead. Now, presumably, the United States would see those weapons coming, and they would take steps to protect the US soldiers stationed on the bases from those missiles. And as a result, the number of casualties that we might see could be a handful, but there will be no fatalities or very, very few fatalities. In that manner, the Iranian government can say that they did indeed retaliate according to what happened before, and that might appease at least to some degree whichever hardliners there are in the government that really, really wanted to go ahead and attack back. But simultaneously, the United States can kind of just brush it off and move on with our lives. Furthermore, I think it is worth noting that this is a way that you could interpret what's going on with the futures markets. Again, futures markets have hardly budged since the United States committed those attacks, and so what that might be a manifestation of is that those markets just don't think that there's going to be much in the way of tit-for-tat responses that progressively progress into something much larger. At the same time, though, I think it is worth noting that this is a very volatile situation, and that it is also perfectly within the realm of plausibility that Iran tries to do something a little bit stronger, maybe not go all the way to closing the Strait of Hormuz immediately, but then we do end up in one of those escalatory spirals where there is a significant chance that Iran does close the Strait of Hormuz, and there are a whole bunch more problems later. Well, hello again from the future, where it appears that Iran is going down the very conservative path. I think there are a couple of caveats worth noting here. One, we're still going to be waiting for the casualty counts to come in and have a better understanding about what sort of materiel was lost, although there already are some indications that the United States was foreseeing that something like this was going to happen, and so the United States had proactively moved out some of the hardware to prevent that from getting destroyed. Nonetheless, there is a possibility that there are a lot of casualties here, and maybe that causes Trump to want to do something back to Iran, and we go back to that retaliatory spiral I was talking about just a second ago. And by I was just talking about a second ago, I mean past me, not current me. Or I guess I'm future me? I'm very confused at this point. Whichever me I am, there's always the possibility that there will be more casualties and then there will be a large response. The other possibility is that this is just the beginning of Iran's plan, and there will be further attacks from Iran, and then that may cause Trump to attack more as well. Who knows? We'll see. Could Iran pull off a similar gambit as Ukraine with smuggling drones, or is that unrealistic? Well, in a word, yeah, that is a serious concern. And again, I've mentioned this a few times before, but that is one of the side projects, or I guess a main project I was working on before the recent series of escalations from Israel and Iran and the United States. I think that's going to be published Monday on the main channel. But I guess I can give you a little bit of spoilers of this. There are a whole bunch of ways that you can get stuff into the United States. There's a large border between the United States and Canada. There's another large border between the United States and Mexico. And of course, there are a whole bunch of ports that you could be sending things to the United States directly. And for the United States to be able to cover all of that, it is exceedingly difficult to actually try to monitor the containers themselves. You're much better off trying to figure out what's going on in the intelligence side and tracking things that way. But even that has some difficulties. And now to spoil the real heart of the video, you don't even have to get things directly into the United States to be able to pull this off. You could just get the stuff sent to Mexico and assemble it there and then launch from Mexico. And a country like Iran certainly has that capacity, and even worse, non-state actors have that capacity as well, and that creates some higher order problems with trying to ensure that not only is your country protected, but what do you do in response to one of those attacks? All of which we'll cover on Monday. I'm hearing word that Iran's parliament has voted to close the Strait of Hormuz. If this were to be indefinite, would this lead to a full-fledged war? In a word, again, yes. Simultaneously, though, I think it is worth proactively noting that we are a long way away from that. If you have the Iranian parliament approving some sort of measure like this, that is different than the Iranian government saying we are actually going to do it. And that's not just some nuance about the power of the Iranian parliament versus the power of the Ayatollah. That's something that's also true about what would happen in a democracy. Even if a democratically elected leader, a head of state, said, we approve that this is going to happen, that is different than actually doing it and actually passing legislation that is enforceable, that will follow through and actually do the particular deed. This is another one of those things that there is a major difference between saying that you're going to do something and actually doing it. And that distinction matters, of course, because actually doing it has economic consequences, and along with those economic consequences, military consequences from the United States. J.D. Vance earlier said something along the lines of that the United States and Iran are not currently at war. And I've seen some criticism of that comment, but it is true. One bombing run, or a series of bombing runs against 3 different targets by various different planes, that does not make a war. A war is a longer-term confrontation between 2 countries that has lots of casualties and, again, continual fighting between the 2 of them. As it stands right now, what we're looking at is either a strike or a series of military strikes all conducted on one night. Future me would also like to remind you that there's been a little bit of retaliation as well. Sorry for the interruption. In contrast, the Strait of Hormuz would have such a large economic consequence and inhibit freedom of navigation that I don't think that there is any doubt that the United States would respond to that. And when the United States does respond to that, that's going to start looking like a more traditional war where there is an ongoing naval engagement between the United States and Iran. But just because there is no uncertainty that the United States would try to stop that and there would be a conflict, that doesn't mean that a conflict isn't going to happen and that Iran is not going to try doing that. Because there could be a lot of uncertainty about just how successful the United States would be in trying to undo the damage that Iran causes by causing the closure of the Strait. How/when would we know if, silly theory, the nuclear material had been quietly moved in the weeks prior to the attack, and Iran basically let the United States make a big show of force and use a couple of expensive missiles to trim mountains? Would European or Asian intelligence be able to know? I don't think that this is a silly concern. It is a serious concern that many policymakers, not only in Washington, but in Europe and in Israel and elsewhere, also share. Now, I think it is worth pointing out here that even if Iran had accomplished that, the attacks, the strikes on those facilities still did something relevant, assuming that the damage is there. Just because Iran has 60% highly enriched uranium, or maybe slightly higher than that, moved elsewhere, that still doesn't solve the problem for Iran. Iran would still have to further enrich that uranium to be able to produce a meaningful nuclear weapon. Now, there are further concerns, perhaps, that maybe Iran had higher enriched uranium than that 60%, and that maybe Iran does have a sufficient concentration of highly enriched uranium to actually be able to produce a bomb. But that would be a further intelligence failure layered onto this. Are intelligence failures possible here? Sure, but it does add an extra layer of complication to having this actually come to fruition. Now, there have been tons of Iranian intelligence failures here. So as a consequence of that, I would imagine that if it was the case that Iran did in fact have some of that highly enriched uranium moved out and it is protected in some secret location, eventually people will find out about this, whether it's US intelligence, Israeli intelligence, European intelligence, or someone else. We will probably figure that out, and it will be known, at least in intelligence circles, maybe not publicly, probably well before Iran starts trying to test a nuclear weapon or assemble a nuclear weapon. Can Israel and the United States actually pull off a regime change without putting boots on the ground? That last bit seems like the current plan of both. I don't think it's currently the plan of either of them. I think it's something that's more of a hope and a dream that is potentially possible, but simultaneously not the type of thing that you should bet on. I have seen a lot of criticism of this strategy online, and perhaps I should use air quotes around strategy there, because once more, I don't think that this is something that the United States or Israel is betting on, but rather it's just something that is possible. I see a lot of criticism of this strategy because there isn't really historical precedent for a country or a pair of countries to use air force power and bombing to have regime change occur in another country without having some sort of military force on the ground. And even if we're thinking about this broadly here, where we're not thinking about US boots on the ground or Israeli boots on the ground, but rather just having some boots on the ground, it's hard to find historical precedents for that. The closest analog to what we're going to be talking about in a moment would be something like Libya, where the United States led a coalition and had an air intervention in Libya, and there was turnover with the leadership in Libya. Gaddafi is no longer in charge of Libya. He's no longer with us, generally speaking. But what happened there to actually allow that to happen was there being an ongoing rebel government trying to fight against Gaddafi. And so what the U.S. intervention did in that particular instance was essentially set the conditions to allow the rebel group to succeed. This is easy to forget in the history of the Libyan civil war, but as that war started, there was a brief moment where it looked like the rebels were in deep trouble. Gaddafi had a somewhat functional air force, and the rebel group did not. So the concern was that the Gaddafi government was going to essentially use the air force to mow down all of the rebels, and effectively the civil war would end before it really got started. And what the U.S. intervention was designed to do was to prevent that from happening, to give the rebels on the ground a fighting chance by effectively disabling the Libyan air force. Now, it is possible that you might recognize what that is a manifestation of, because it's a thing that we've been talking about over and over and over again over the last week. That is an example of a strategic complementarity, that there is something that the United States could do, namely provide air cover, that would allow the rebel group to succeed. But the United States could not have success alone with the air intervention, and simultaneously, the rebels in Libya could not succeed without the United States there. So you have to have both of those things together to make it work, but conditional on one of those things being present, it makes the other one a whole lot more valuable. So again, we do not have historical precedents for this succeeding without having boots on the ground of some kind. But I would like to emphasize to anyone listening to this right now that you don't have to have a historical precedent for something to happen. You can have new things happen. New things happen every day, and there is a bit of a method to the madness here. The United States and Israel have essentially set the conditions to make a rebel group be more successful if a rebel group were to form. Obviously, there is more that Israel and the United States could do in that regard. For example, if they wanted to make things really spicy, they could try to assassinate the Ayatollah, assuming that, in fact, the United States knows where the Ayatollah is, as Donald Trump had threateningly posted on Truth Social not too long ago. If you have a decapitation strike like that, that is going to force some sort of change to the government. It will certainly result in chaos within the government, which would further set the conditions for the success of a rebel group inside of Iran. Now, is that something that is worth betting on? I don't think so, probably not. But there's a difference between something being a good bet and something being possible. There's also another question about whether this is a good idea, and certainly what we might have learned from the experience in Libya following the fall of Gaddafi. There are some big question marks there as well. But again, whether something is a good idea or not is different than whether it is possible. Since Russia and Iran are aligned in their hatred of the West, why doesn't Russia give Iran some of their nukes? It sounds stupid, but I genuinely don't know. I don't think this is a particularly stupid question because it's something that is commonly asked, and the answer isn't obvious. So I do think that this is a relevant and useful question. I think there's two parts to this answer. The first part is that Iran and Russia aren't actually that close. This is hitting on a common theme that you've probably heard from me a few times this week. But just to reiterate quickly, the coalition that Russia has with Iran and China and North Korea, and to a lesser extent the Houthis in Yemen, that coalition is not united in a common goal. That coalition is united in a common means to various different ends. The common means is a disabling of the Western coalition, but the ends are all over the place. For Russia, it's territory in Ukraine. For China, it's Taiwan. For Iran, it's greater control and influence over the Middle East. So that's the base step. The next step that ties together with that base step is the idea that if you give your nuclear weapons to another country, then you are geopolitically responsible for whatever happens with those donated nukes, not the country that is actually using the nuclear weapons. So, for example, if Russia gives Iran nuclear weapons, or alternatively, North Korea gives Iran nuclear weapons, whatever Iran ultimately does with those nuclear weapons, at some level, Russia or North Korea are geopolitically responsible for that. Well, because there are frictions within that coalition, and because Iran is not ideologically aligned with Russia, and North Korea is not ideologically aligned with Iran, neither of those countries wants to bear the responsibility of what happens if Iran starts using a nuclear weapon. In contrast, if Russia really wanted to do something along the lines of giving Iran nuclear power, without actually having to worry about those sorts of side effects of Iran deviating too far away from what Russia wants Iran to do, the solution here is to provide a nuclear umbrella, which is something that is much more commonly done in the West, which is some sort of promise made from one country to another that says, we will allow you to use our nuclear weapons under some certain circumstances. Namely, where that usually comes down is if your country is attacked by a third country with nuclear weapons, then we, the United States, for example, might protect you, South Korea. If South Korea is the victim of a North Korean or a Chinese nuclear attack, then perhaps the United States has indicated a willingness to use nuclear weapons to fight back. Obviously, there are big question marks for the protege country in this situation. That would be South Korea, for example, because a promise to do something is not actually necessarily the follow-through. What actually happens when push comes to shove may be different than what the United States has said it was going to do before. That's a big problem with words and actions. Obviously, we've talked a lot about not listening to what people say, but rather watching what those leaders are doing. The problem with trying to make promises about the future is that you're even a further step removed. Saying I'm going to do something in the future, well, even if you intended to do that right now, even if you were saying this seriously, and it was an actual follow-through commitment that you were willing to do right now, having that same sort of follow-through in the future may not actually be there. The problem for the protege countries is that they are not the ones in the position of power. They kind of have to take whatever is given to them. And even in this particular case, Russia is unwilling to provide that sort of nuclear umbrella to Iran, never mind give Iran nuclear weapons. Greetings again from Future Me, who is aware that today Dmitry Medvedev said something along the lines of, countries are just lining up to give Iran nuclear weapons, which is really funny if you think about it, because it makes it sound like tens or maybe hundreds of countries are lining up to give Iran nuclear weapons, when there are only about 200 countries total in the world, and there are only 9 countries that currently have nuclear weapons. And furthermore, of those 9 countries that have nuclear weapons, only 3 could plausibly want to give them to Iran. That would be North Korea, China, and then, of course, the third one is Russia, so you could just be speaking for yourself there. What is plausible here would be if Russia extended its nuclear umbrella to Iran in the same way that it has with Belarus. But once more, that's a flimsy promise, and I'm not sure you're going to find many countries in the West that would believe that Russia would actually do that when push comes to shove. Never mind the fact that nuclear umbrellas are tending to protect countries from nuclear attacks, and I don't think the United States or Israel is about to be launching nuclear weapons at Iran when the conventional wars are going pretty well. And even if the conventional war changed, it's not like Israel or the United States would be firing nuclear weapons anyway. But I think Past Me has some questions about North Korea. If the United States is putting this much effort into forcibly stopping Iran's nuclear weapons program, why did they not do the same to North Korea's nuclear weapons program? Isn't North Korea considered to be just as much, if not more, of a rogue state from the US perspective? Well, remember, at the most basic level, the calculus for a preventive war is a comparison between the shift in the balance of power and the costs of fighting the preventive war. Certainly with nuclear weapons and North Korea, you're probably looking at a pretty substantial shift in the balance of power, because having nuclear weapons in North Korea pretty much protects the North Korean regime, Kim Jong-un right now, from any sort of foreign influence to remove Kim Jong-un from power. It's going to be really difficult for the United States to try to have some sort of regime change in North Korea, or South Korea to be able to do the same, if either of those countries are facing some sort of nuclear retaliation for doing so. However, the countervailing factor for North Korea is that North Korea, at the time it was developing nuclear weapons, and still today, has a whole bunch of artillery along the North Korean border with South Korea, pointed at South Korea. And Seoul is not very far away either, thinking about missiles and the like, which means that if there had been some sort of preventive war against North Korea, there would have been a lot of death. Actually, there's a good story about this from the Clinton administration. Once upon a time, early on in North Korea's progress toward a nuclear weapon, Clinton was worried about what was happening and thinking to himself, hey, maybe we should stop this. So he approached his military officials and asked, could we do this? Is it possible? And the military officials thought about it and said, yeah, it's possible. We definitely could, and we would probably succeed in our efforts to stop North Korea from developing a nuclear weapon. The trade-off would be a whole bunch of dead people as a consequence of that artillery that I was just talking about a moment ago, and all sorts of economic catastrophe. And Bill Clinton, upon hearing that, remarks something along the lines of, oh, I didn't realize that, and afterward really doesn't bring it up again. If we think about what's going on with Iran right now, in contrast, Israel basically disabled Iran. And at that point, the United States just had to come in and do cleanup duty, literally mop things up, because the bunker busters that the United States used are called mops. The United States mopped up the last few of those facilities, and there wasn't much in the way that Iran could do in terms of causing damage, like the artillery strikes that North Korea would be able to inflict on South Korea. Clearly, there are still some question marks about what the retaliation is going to be from Iran, and the United States should not be looking at this yet as a free attack. There are still some concerns there, so I don't want to minimize those sorts of concerns. They're still there. They're just not nearly as large as what was painfully obvious to military planners back in the 1990s about doing the same sort of preventive action against North Korea. I was a bit confused with what you were trying to say with your last video, the one covering opportunity strikes, or wars of opportunism, and how it relates to the risk of a world war. Do you think that U.S. involvement in Iran has a high chance of sparking an opportunity for China to invade Taiwan? Or were you simply using an unlikely hypothetical to illustrate your point? Well, to be clear, I'm not living my life right now thinking that World War III is about to start. But simultaneously, I think if you compare what the world looks like right now to, say, just 5 years ago, the chances of World War III have multiplied by quite a factor, even if, again, the overall probability of World War III happening still remains relatively low. At the same time, though, World War III is very concerning, and so even if something is a low probability event, if the amount of damage that would be caused by it is very high, it is still something that we have to spend lots of mental energy thinking about. Now, as it relates to the video in question, and actually to go on a slight tangent here for a moment, when the United States struck Iran and the news broke, there was a sudden interest in that video. If I looked at the YouTube analytics, it spiked in the immediate aftermath of that news becoming public. And I always get concerned when I'm looking at my YouTube analytics and I see something spike, because usually that is corresponding to bad news happening, and it might be something that I am not looking at the news because I'm not paying attention to the news at the time. I'm just randomly looking at my YouTube analytics. Whenever I see a spike, usually I start getting concerned and I start moving over to news websites to try to figure out what's happening and what I might have missed. Anyway, the main message of that video is that for a world war to happen, and not just to have a world at war, but to have a genuine world war, it needs to be the case that the various conflicts that are all happening simultaneously are all having an effect on one another. And one way that you get a world war like that to start is various different countries trying to take advantage of a window of opportunity caused by another country being distracted by another war. For example, the United States getting distracted in Iran, allowing perhaps China to take advantage of the situation in Taiwan and invade Taiwan. Well, what is the risk of that now, given that we have observed the U.S. attack on Iran, which is information that we did not have when I published that video on the possibility of World War III due to wars of opportunism? As it turns out, the United States really didn't tax itself very much so far in that attack. Obviously, the United States used a bunch of bunker-busting munitions, but that doesn't tax the overall effectiveness of the U.S. Navy, which would be the primary source of the U.S. military power over in Taiwan and with an invasion of the island. However, that comes with the caveat of so far. And it is fully possible that in the next week or so, we might see further escalation between the United States and Iran if, for example, Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz. Here's another avenue where Iran might calculate that it could have some success in trying to shut down the Strait of Hormuz and coerce the United States economically through whatever happens with oil prices. As we talked about earlier today, the United States would have to respond to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz with a traditional naval battle. And a concern that the White House will very quickly have once that starts going is how much the United States is spending on that, what sort of resources are being taxed on that the United States does not have the easy ability to replace with stocks sitting somewhere in a warehouse. Because the more that the United States spends in Iran, the less the United States has available to deter China from invading Taiwan. And China invading Taiwan is a bigger priority than whatever is going to be going on in the Middle East. So maybe Iran decides that trying this out is worthwhile because over the long run, the United States may try to broker some sort of deal with Tehran to make sure that this ends so that the United States can preserve its force over what's happening in China. And actually, you only need to go back a month or so to see the same sort of concern from the White House as it relates to the operations that were happening against the Houthis. The White House became very concerned that the United States was spending so much in terms of its resources. Not money, but resources, the military resources that it has, that it cannot easily replace by just writing a check. There was a lot of concern that the Houthis were taxing too much of the United States there, which is leaving the United States vulnerable elsewhere. So, sure, everything is fine for now, but whether it will be fine later on remains to be seen. What's the point of these videos? It's like modeling hypotheticals without knowing critical parameters to derive any sort of useful conclusion. Well, I know that this comment was not made in good faith, but I am going to give you a good faith response to that because I think this is a teachable point. A big life upgrade that you can make is understanding that you can learn a lot while not knowing specific parameters. So one example that you are already familiar of this with lines on maps is the idea that I don't need to know what the balance of power is between two countries to be able to make a declaration that there is going to exist a range of settlements that are mutually better for those countries than fighting a war. I don't need to know whether the balance of power is 50-50 or 75-25 or whatever. All I have to know is that, in theory, those two countries should be able to figure out what the expected outcome of a war is, and certainly they spend a lot of time individually trying to figure out what the expected outcome of a war is. And as long as war is costly, and people are going to die, and money is going to be spent on the process, that itself guarantees that there is that range of mutually preferable deals. Part of the reason why that is such a powerful thing to be able to figure out is that it applies globally, and temporally too. Doesn't matter what time period we're looking at, doesn't matter which two countries we are looking at, it will be the case that there should be a deal between the two of them. And having that sort of knowledge is much better than trying to look at every pair of countries in any given time period and try to reason out whether those two countries had a range of settlements that, in theory, in principle, should have been better than fighting a war. We can just do it all at once. And that saves us a ton of time because there are a whole bunch of pairs of countries and a whole bunch of different time periods when we might be interested in answering that same exact question. Moreover, if you want to understand what history tells us about the future, you have to do things in this way. You have to model phenomenon because history does not repeat itself. That is a cliche that is wrong. There is, however, an alternative cliche which speaks, I think, much better to how we should be using history and what history can do for us, which is the idea that history rhymes. In other words, give me a specific historical case. We will never see an exact duplication of that. We will not see a duplication of the individuals involved, of the military power in the situation, of the ideological interests, whatever. We will never see an exact duplication of that. Still, that does not mean we can't use that specific historical case to understand other historical cases or about what's happening right now or what will happen in the future. The trick, though, is that you have to have an underlying model of the behavior of that particular historical case, and you need to use that underlying model to be able to apply the understanding to other cases. But once more, because the exact specifics of that particular case are never going to be duplicated, you have to do this in, as the question is asking, modeling hypotheticals without knowing critical parameters. You have to do it generally. You have to say there is a probability of victory P. There is a level of resolve R. There are costs of war C. You have to do all of that generally inside of a model to be able to generalize the understanding of the one specific historical case. And the reason I do that on this channel is because I want you to understand how geopolitics works broadly. I don't want you to understand what's going on specifically between Ukraine and Russia, or specifically between Israel and Iran, or specifically between China and Taiwan. I want you to understand the general factors that play at all of those cases, so that when you're looking at any one case, you will be able to know more about what's happening, and moreover, when you encounter new things that have not yet happened but could happen in the future, you will already have some sort of basic understanding of the strategic environment that those actors are facing. Again, the only way to do that is to think about geopolitics abstractly, and that is why I do that on this channel. Wouldn't promising to spend more on defense also lead to an opportunity? This is in reference to the upcoming NATO summit, where presumably the allies are going to make a pledge to spend 5% of GDP on defense, which is up from 2%, and even if we're just looking at core defense spending, that would be an increase from 2% to 3.5%. The expected results for an aggressor in the future could go below what the minimum would be for war today, because even if the money is spent today, weapons don't just appear. This is an all-time great question, because it is highlighting the exact point from the previous question, where if you understand models of human behavior or models of geopolitics, that when new things happen, you will be able to more quickly draw connections to things that have happened in the past. And this question does in fact hit on an important point, which is that if NATO spending is increasing, that means that NATO is going to be more powerful over time. So if you're thinking about this in Beijing, if you believe that in the future it's going to be the case that NATO is going to be able to handle two wars at once, then it becomes more difficult, for example, at that point, for you to invade Taiwan, even though, interestingly, NATO spending is supposed to be covering the defense of the NATO alliance, and the NATO alliance is all inside of the North Atlantic area. But when we live in this interconnected world, even a country like China has to be concerned about this sort of thing. And even if, again, the point of NATO is to be able to defend the NATO members from attacks on NATO soil. If all of this forecloses Russia's ability to do things against NATO in the future, then that itself has to be concerning at some level to China. Now, with all of that as a preface, I don't think it should be particularly concerning in this case. The reason being is that it's not going to be a situation where overnight you have allies jumping from 2% to 3.5%. It's unclear exactly how this is going to be negotiated at the summit, but we're going to see some sort of step level where in 1 year it's going to be 0.2% or 0.15%, some number, and that is going to increase each year over time, so that maybe over a 5-year period or a 10-year period, there is going to be that increase in military spending. And also, as the comment notes, as this question notes, even if you're spending more, that spending does not immediately translate into more military power. There's still going to be a delay between when you actually start spending the money and when you start seeing better production coming out of your military-industrial complex. It turns out that that type of delay is very important for the declining states calculus in deciding whether fighting a preventive war right now is better than allowing that power shift to transpire. You usually don't hear me talking about that on the channel because it turns out that trying to have intertemporal calculations is very difficult to illustrate, especially when I'm just trying to draw some lines on maps, again, for illustrative purposes, to make communicating the central point of preventive war obvious to those that are watching. But in terms of traditional academic publishing on the subject, that is definitely something that we will incorporate in these types of models. And it shouldn't be particularly surprising to learn that the length of the power shift actually does matter for the declining state choosing to launch a preventive war. Just think about a couple of extreme cases. Imagine that there is, first, a large power shift that is occurring literally today, where if you fight a preventive war right now, you could stop it, but if you don't fight it today, there is going to be a huge shift in the balance of power going from today to tomorrow. That type of thing is going to be particularly scary to a declining state, and you might get a declining state to fight a war as a result. Well, let's compare that same exact shift in the balance of power that's occurring instantaneously to the same shift in the balance of power that's occurring over 20 years. In other words, imagine your lines on maps, you have an expected outcome today, and you have an expected outcome in the future. Let's keep those distances exactly the same, but have one occur instantly and one occur over 20 years. Well, the 20 years is going to look bad today, it's going to look bad tomorrow, and it's going to look bad the next day, and it's going to look bad for 20 years. But the amount that it's going to look bad in any given period, any given day, is relatively small compared to the huge accumulation all at once of a whole bunch of bad things all happening in one day. And I think that the potential 5% commitment from NATO allies is looking something more like the 20-year period of a shift in the balance of power than an instantaneous shift in the balance of power. And so as a result, it's going to be easier for that thing to smoothly go over than compared to what would happen if just overnight suddenly the NATO allies were spending a whole bunch more money on the alliance and defense. Why does everything have to be lines on maps? Well, not everything is lines on maps, but it turns out that what I study and what I'm an expert in is crisis bargaining theory. And so when you click on this channel, I'm going to be discussing things that are relevant to crisis bargaining theory, and things that aren't relevant to crisis bargaining theory I'm tending not to discuss. There are a few other things I do academically that are not the traditional crisis bargaining theory, and when those things do happen in the news, I do want to talk about them as well. But again, the vast majority of what I study is crisis bargaining theory, and so when you click on this channel, you're going to get crisis bargaining theory, and the lines on maps will continue until the morale improves. Asking this question is more or less asking the question of, why does the gas station sell gas? And on that note, I think that's a good time for me to stop today. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.